And we're studying tonight 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. And the title of our lesson is The Man of Sin. Now, that's a more difficult passage than we might imagine, but I think I'm going to try to present it as simply as I can. And hopefully it will help you because there are definitely some principles that are learned in this study that are worth our time. Keep in mind also that 1 and 2 Thessalonians are some of the earliest epistles written after the book of Acts is completed. The epistles of the New Testament are not in chronological order. The Thessalonians were new converts. They're young in the faith. And even in 1 and 2 Thessalonians, we can see evidence of that, and you'll see it in our lesson tonight. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, we'll begin by noticing that they were concerned about the second coming of the Lord. And Paul writes, "Now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, we ask you not to be soon shaken in in mind, or troubled, either by spirit or by word or by letter, as if from us, as though the day of Christ had come." It's amazing to me that these new converts have the idea that somehow or another, by rumor or by false ideas or false impressions, someone has come to these Thessalonians and said, "Hey, did you hear Christ came already?" And imagine the panic in their voice and in their minds when they think, we prepared ourselves for the second coming and we missed it. You and I wouldn't think anything like that today because we have a better understanding of the Lord's second coming. But we also have the completed New Testament, which these people did not have at that time. And so we're thankful that Paul wrote this epistle and that you and I can sit back in the comfort of our home or in the church assembly and study and learn from this. But it was a real concern for them. He did not want them to be near hysterical as they were, because he said there's something that has to happen before the Lord comes again. And so keep that in mind. He said, do not be shaken in mind. And that word shaken in mind is the same word that's used in Acts 16 when the earthquake shook the prison that Paul and Silas were in. So you can imagine they're not just a little bit worried, they're scared to death. And then you have the word troubled. And the word troubled means to frighten or to alarm or to excite. And so these brethren were nearly beside themselves, thinking, how could we have missed out on the second coming? And now what are we going to do? And I can imagine the fear in their minds when they thought that. So God calms their fears by giving the Apostle Paul an historical event that was to happen sometime in the future, quite distant actually from the Thessalonians, that would have to occur first before the Lord returns. And that's what he's telling them here. Well, as we read about that, he says in verse 3, "Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day," that is the second coming of the Lord, "that day will not come unless the falling away comes first." Notice the definite article both in the English and the Greek. We're not talking about any apostasy, but a particular apostasy. The falling away will come first. "And the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God." So we're talking about a particular apostasy. The word falling away comes from the Greek word apostasia, from which we get our English word apostasy. But the definite article tells us that there's something very particular in mind. So that's part of the aspect. The second one is that he was also called the man of sin. The man of sin will be revealed. At the time that Paul's writing, it's not quite as obvious, but it will be soon. And number 3, the third aspect of this event is he who restrains will be taken out of the way. And what that's referring to is someone or something is preventing the man of sin from being fully exposed for what he is. And so those are the 3 qualities that make us realize that we're not talking about a general apostasy. There are many apostasies or departures from the faith, both in the Old Testament and in the New. But Paul has one particular one in mind when he talks to the Thessalonians. Keep in mind, and here's an important point, that regardless of whether we can identify the man of sin or whether we can understand the exact apostasy, this chapter is still telling the Thessalonians that Christ's coming was not imminent for them, but it would be for a little bit later. The reality was that about 300 or 400 years would take place before Christ could possibly come back because of this dated time signature. But God doesn't reveal that, but that shows us another thought that I think is interesting. Christians in the first century lived as though Christ was going to come back any moment, any day, any time. And that's how we live today. We don't know if Christ is coming back today, tomorrow, next week, next month, or next year. He could possibly come back at any time, and we need to have that disposition. The first century Christians did, maybe even more so than we, because they lived during the life of Jesus Christ. They saw the miracles or heard about the miracles as recent history. They obeyed the gospel and were some of the first Christians on the earth. And so you have Thessalonians who are new converts and still young in the faith, and so there's a lot they don't understand. Paul had preached them about the second coming of the Lord and had made such a tremendous impression on them that, as we see in 1 Thessalonians, some said, well, if Christ is coming back, I'm just not going to work. I'm quitting my job because he's liable to come back any moment. And now in 2 Thessalonians, they say, come back. Well, he came back last year or last week or last month and scared them to death. Well, Christ is coming back again, and it could be any time. And so now we can act that way and be prepared for it. Notice in verse 3, he said, for the coming, that day will not come unless the falling away comes first. As we've said, it's a specific historical event. The word that's used here, it always was used in the Septuagint, the Old Testament Greek translation. Always used for religious departures. For example, we see that word being used in Joshua 22:22 when Israel was accusing a certain tribe of having departed from the faith, and they denied it. We see it also in 2 Chronicles chapter 29 and verse 19, 2 Chronicles 33 and 19, and also in Jeremiah chapter 2 and verse 19, always of religious departure from the faith. So you can check those references out and see that that's the case. This word only appears one other time in the New Testament. That's in Acts 21 and verse 21. And so in all these cases, it has reference to a departure from the faith. Now in Acts 21 and verse 21, the Jews in Jerusalem were falsely accusing Paul of leading people away from the law of Moses, saying that they were to not be a part of that anymore. Paul wasn't telling people to depart from the law of Moses. He was simply teaching that it had come to its natural conclusion, and they did not see it that way. So again, we have a specific historical event. It is a religious apostasy that we're talking about, and it's going to happen in the future from their perspective. And then he says, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition. Now that defines again the specific apostasy that Paul is talking about. The man of sin is revealed. That's the result of the falling away. The man of sin is involved in that. He's also called the son of perdition. But man of sin, the word sin is the Greek word anomia, which means lawlessness. In Matthew chapter 7, Jesus said, in the judgment day, depart from me, you workers of iniquity, the King James Version says. The New King James says, depart from me, workers of lawlessness. It's the Greek word anomia. Nomos is law, and the prefix a means not, so no law. And it means they're not subject to any law, whether of man or of God. They make up their own rules. They live by their own system. The son of perdition. The word perdition there is used to refer to a man doomed to eternal misery, according to Joseph Henry Thayer's Greek-English lexicon. So we're not talking about someone who is just a little bit bad, but we're talking about one who is condemned because of his life to eternal damnation. That same word was used in reference to Judas after he betrayed Jesus Christ. We see that in John chapter 17 and verse 12, where there Jesus said it would have been better for that man not to have been born, and he calls him the son of perdition. Sad, isn't it? But that's who this person is in this text. So now what can we summarize? Well, we know that this is a specific apostasy. It reveals the man of sin, in a near future event, and he's also called the son of perdition, and so he's headed for certain and absolute destruction. Well, there's a number of theories that identify this man of sin, and so we won't go into all of those. If you're interested in the many theories about who this man of sin is, let me know, and if we have enough suggestions, I may preach a second lesson on that. But I'm going to give you a few of them and just mention them tonight, and then I'm going to identify the one that I believe is the correct one based upon our context. But some say, well, it's the Roman emperor, and the thing that is hindering him from being totally revealed would be the Roman Empire. Another says, well, the man of sin is the Roman Catholic papacy, and what is the hindering influence is the Roman Empire, hindering the Roman papacy from being what it should be. And just as a hint, that's the one I believe is correct. We'll show you why in a moment. The third one is, well, a general spirit of apostasy. It's called the Antichrist in 1 John, and some say, well, that's just a general spirit of apostasy, and so that's the one it's referring to, and it's not a specific event, and so they refer to that. And that's where I disagree. I think it's more than just one general apostasy or one spirit of apostasy. We see a number of those in the New Testament. We'll refer to those in a minute. The less reasonable possibilities that you hear people affirming today is that it refers to Judaism and the Roman Empire was the hindering influence. Others say it's a future Antichrist that's going to come to the earth and it's going to cause everybody to fall down and worship them. And it's going to be such a massive apostasy that Jesus Christ is going to descend from heaven and have a physical battle against the Antichrist and destroy him, and then he's going to set up his kingdom in Jerusalem and reign for 1,000 years. That's the typical premillennial view of this passage, and it is absolutely incorrect. Jesus already is sitting on his throne in heaven right now. He doesn't have to come back to the earth to set up an earthly kingdom to reign from Jerusalem. Acts chapter 2 that we studied this morning says that he is now sitting at the right hand of God on the throne of David because God raised him up for that purpose. So we know that's not it. Others have suggested whoever the terrible person is of the era, Hitler back in World War II, Joseph Stalin from Russia, Khrushchev as well, probably some have said Mao Zedong from China and others. Well, every time an evil person arises, they think, well, that's the man of sin. But Paul has somebody specifically in mind, and we're going to limit it to a religious influence because that's what the text does. So that hinders us from choosing just a political figure. And others say, well, it's none other than Satan himself. Well, the problem with that is, in the text it says, he opposes and exalts all that is called God, and that he is like Satan. So if he's Satan, he wouldn't be like himself. He would be him. So that's not the possibility either. Well, let's narrow it down now by looking at verse 4, which Paul defines more specifically who he has in mind. This man of sin, this son of perdition, opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing that he himself is God. Well, now what that tells us is that his realm of influence is religious. He has a self-exaltation above every other object of worship. Secondly, the realm of influence is the church or religion in general. And he also claims to be God. And we have several historical figures that we could point to that. When Caesar was called Caesar Augustus, Augustus means the August one, and therefore is a term that incites worship. But all the Caesars wanted to be worshipped as God. They did that for the purpose of trying to unite a kingdom that was otherwise divided by the conquered countries. And as we read in Daniel chapter 2, Rome is represented by the mixture of iron and clay, so it was never going to be unified as the Caesars intended and wanted. God intended for the Roman Empire to be an empire that was united but partly divided. Furthermore, another example would be the prince of Tyre in Ezekiel chapter 28, who considered himself the prince of heaven. And so again, that would be one who thought he was too big to be toppled by someone else, and so he considered himself God. We see King Herod Agrippa in Acts chapter 12, when the people worshipped him and said, the image of a God and not of a man. And he accepted that worship, and the next thing we know, he died and was eaten by worms. So God doesn't approve of that kind of behavior. But none of those characters fit our text because, again, this is someone who exalts himself and wants to be worshipped. Secondly, he does so in the religious arena, in the church. And thirdly, he claims that he is God. So when we narrow it down to those choices, we see these characteristics of the man of sin. And now we'll come back to that in a moment. But keep in mind what he says in verse 6. Now you know what is restraining, that he may be revealed in his own time. When he says what is restraining, the word restraining is simply that which holds back, that which retards development, or delays something from coming. So here is a man of sin, the son of perdition, who is going to be exposed or revealed, I guess I should say, as somebody who claims to be God, who's in the realm of religion, and who wants to be worshipped above every other creature upon the earth. But that revelation hasn't taken place yet because there's a restraining influence, which I believe to be the Roman Empire itself and the Caesars who want to be worshipped as God. So as long as the Roman Empire is in effect and these Caesars have the power to claim worship, this man of sin, the son of perdition, cannot reveal himself because he's being held back. That he may be revealed in his own time. God has a timetable for everything. And in this case, the time is permitted by God, which will be, as I said, anywhere from 300 to 600 years in the future from which we're writing here. Now Paul explains something else that helps us narrow down the apostasy, the departure, the specific one he has in mind here. Verse 7, he says, for the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Whatever's going on that's going to become a great apostasy with the man of sin, the son of perdition, claimed to be God in the temple of God, is already beginning in Paul's day. Well, it says, only he who now restrains will do so until he's taken out of the way. The New King James commentators have capitalized he here because they believe it's God that's restraining. But I think he who restrains has reference to the Caesars of the Roman Empire, so that would not be a capitalized he. The mystery of lawlessness, that means the same ungodliness as the man of sin himself. And it's already at work. The seed of the apostasy is already in existence in Paul's day. Well, there are several apostasies we read about in the New Testament. For example, the Judaizers were leading some astray. Paul writes the Galatian epistle about that very apostasy. In Galatians 1, he says, I marvel that you are so soon removed from him who called you in the grace of Christ unto another gospel, which is not another, but there's some who trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. The Judaizers are those who said, you can become a Christian, you can obey Jesus Christ, you can be washed in the blood of the Lamb, but you also have to be circumcised to be saved. That's apostasy. And Paul says, what I'm talking about is happening already. Well, Romans and Galatians both are written to defeat that influence. But then we have Jewish ritualism, much opposed by the Hebrew writer, because this is people who wanted to go back and have a physical worship in a physical temple in a physical location. And so they're really just observing a ritual. And some of the Hebrew Christians were thinking about going back and worshiping in the temple in Jerusalem. And of course, by 70 AD, that was eliminated. But until that time, you had that kind of apostasy. Furthermore, you had paganism, the kind we read about in 1 Corinthians 5, where a man had his father's wife, was unashamed. Colossians chapter 2, 16 through 23, which talks about a will worship that men practice that has an appearance of religiosity, but is in fact very vain and empty. And so again, we have passages written to defeat that. So there are a number of other departures that we could refer to, but whatever Paul's talking about, he said the seed of departure is already beginning. Now if we go back to Acts chapter 20, I think what he has reference to and has prophesied about in that chapter is the very thing he's identifying, even though he doesn't say it in the 2 Thessalonian letter. You'll remember as he called for the Ephesian elders to come meet with him in Acts chapter 20, he said in verse 28, "Therefore take heed to yourselves and to all the flock among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to shepherd the church of God which is purchased with his own blood. For I know this," now watch it, "that after my departure savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock." That seems to be an outside influence. Savage wolves would come in and take away some of the saints. But then he says, "Also from among yourselves." Some have interpreted that to mean members of the church. I think in the text it means among the eldership in the church. From among the eldership, men will arise speaking perverse things to draw away disciples after them. Well, it's a matter now of historical record that the earliest apostasy of any kind that really affected the church is when the elders of the church selected one man to be over them and called him the bishop. And now you have an elder who's being called the bishop, who is the head and the representative of the local church, and he begins to claim more power and more influence, and pretty soon he travels in regions and in countries representing his congregation. And so now these pastors or these shepherds, these bishops, now begin to vote among themselves, and they become influential in that they're not just the head of a local congregation, they become a head of a province or a region. And eventually, as you can imagine, by 600 AD, the ultimate election between all of these bishops was the chief bishop, which became the Roman Pope. So Paul says that's going to happen. And when he tells us in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, this element has already begun to establish itself and evince itself, that fits very well in what Paul is saying here in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. And keep in mind also, 1 Timothy 4 talks about the apostasy when it says, "The Spirit expressly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith." There's an apostasy. He said they will give heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons. Now when it says deceiving spirits, false doctrine. Doctrines of demons. Well, if it's not from Christ, it's from the devil. Speaking lies and hypocrisy. Having their own conscience seared with a hot iron. That's how they can do these things. They're so interested in power and control and dominance over others, they'll do anything to obtain it. But then we see some signals that tell us that what we're on to in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is even more telling. This apostasy forbids to marry. Well, now, what apostasy do you know of that fits that bill? Well, the Roman Catholic priests are not allowed to marry. And commanding to abstain from foods, or the King James Version says from meat, which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. That's another indication of Roman Catholicism, because they forbid eating meats on Friday. And so this fits very well into what we're saying, and this is the apostasy that was beginning even in Paul's time, and when the Roman Empire's influence which kept the what later came to be called the Holy Roman Empire, a religious political entity. They could not express their political power until the Roman Empire became so weak the Caesars could no longer dominate. So that's what he means when he says, "He who now restrains the Caesars," the Roman rulers of the political nation of Rome. The term in the Greek is masculine, not that which restrains, but he who now restrains. And so the man is intended, the emperor of Rome, the Caesar of Rome, whoever it might be, one who demanded worship of Caesars as God, that emperor restrained the apostasy by forbidding Christianity as an accepted religion and to keep these bishops from having political power. But when the emperor restrained the power-hungry bishops and they could not assume the political power they wanted, then the man of sin, the son of perdition, could not show himself as he would later on. But by 325 A.D., when you have Christianity as an accepted religion, and keep in mind when you're studying church history, what's called Christianity with Constantine as the head over the church, you now have a man who assumes both political and religious power and thinks he's in control of both the country and the politics and the church. So he calls together the Nicene Council. Says all you bishops need to come together and we need to decide on certain things. We're going to have a meeting and we're going to tell everybody else this is what you should believe about the Bible. Later on we have Theodosius doing the same thing. These men viewed themselves as both head of policy in politics and in religion, and therefore they are now showing themselves to be what God warned about. Until he is taken out of the way, when the Roman emperor and the Caesar's influence ceased, then these men could seize the power that was there because of the vacuum, the emptiness, and they began to take over. Now you stop and think about Roman Catholicism in its early days up through what we call the Dark Ages. It was dark because the man of sin, the son of perdition, so imposed religious and political power that they claimed control not only over people in the church, but also over the whole world. In verses 8 and 9, Paul goes on to say, "And then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming, even him whose coming is after the working of Satan, with all power and signs and lying wonders." So after Rome's defeat, the true nature of the apostasy could be clearly seen. The working of Satan with all power, with all signs, with all lying wonders. The Greek literally means the working of Satan with all lying powers, lying signs, and lying wonders. Roman Catholicism has always claimed miracles, exorcisms, shrines, their various stigmata, Mass, which is the crucifixion of Jesus Christ every time they have Mass, and all these other things that are very superstitious, but they claim as miraculous power of the Catholic Church. Fits again perfectly into what Paul is saying here. And these things will continue until the second coming of Jesus Christ, because here he says Jesus Christ will destroy with the spirit of his mouth and the brightness of his coming. That's when it will come to an end. So the apostasy, which seed of apostasy began in Paul's day, but which was restrained for a few hundred years before the Roman influence could then be taken away, and then the religious political power of what became the Roman Catholic Church could then evince itself. And we can go back and study in history, and it fits perfectly what we've shown and described here. Now in verses 10 through 12, here's something that's an application for us. Who believes this kind of thing? It says, with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth that they might be saved. Paul said, grievous wolves come in not sparing the flock. Well, who could grievous wolves find as a victim? Someone who's a carnal, weak Christian? Someone who loves a lie that tells them you can practice your sin and still be okay? And again, we see that evidenced in the Roman Catholic Church when they sold indulgences in the 15th century, saying you can buy forgiveness for your sins even before you commit the sin. And this was done by the Roman Catholic Church to fill their coffers so they could build golden temples all over the cathedrals, all over the world. And so again, we see that that's the kind of thing that would cause people to follow them. And we have different religions, which are other apostasies today, which offer a free grace, a free salvation, an easy way to heaven. And that's all because of the same principle we see here. It's an unrighteous deception because it's not true. It's among those who perish because they did not receive the love of the truth that they might be saved. And for this reason, God will send them strong delusion that they should believe the lie, that they all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. So keep these points in mind. God allows a man to perish because he does not receive the love of the truth. There's an application for you. Do you love the truth? Somebody says, oh, I love the truth. Well, we give lip service to it, but do you really love it? Well, what do you mean? Well, what I mean by loving the truth is you accept the New Testament as the sole authority of Jesus Christ, the revelation of heaven to men through Jesus Christ, his last will and testament. And you use that book in saying whatever the Bible says, whatever Jesus teaches in the New Testament, I'm going to believe that and accept that regardless of the consequences. When you say that, a lot of people fall off. Well, I don't think you have to be legalistic, they'll say. I don't think you have to follow the letter of the law. We've even had some in the Lord's church say in the past, well, we do lots of things for which we don't have authority. And as I pointed out in our bulletin this morning, there's one fellow who argued for the practice of Easter in the church because the Bible doesn't say not to. So you see, you have all these people who give lip service to the truth, but in reality, they're not practicing the truth. They're practicing their own religion. That's nothing new. Jesus in his day condemned the Jews because he said they teach for doctrine the commandments of men. He said, you worship me in vain. And so if we do that today, it's because we chose to, because we wanted an easy way out. We wanted a McDonald's type of drive-through religion. And shame on us if that's us. Because that's the kind of people that are perfect apostates. God allows a man to perish because he has pleasure in unrighteousness. How many people have gone off to a false religion because they told them you can practice your form of unrighteousness and we won't judge you? Churches are full of people like that, and they are satisfied with their religion because God has allowed them to believe a lie. So he sends them a strong delusion that they should believe the lie. Now, in our context, I think it has specific reference to the apostasy that we've talked about. But the principle of it applies over and over again down through the years. God will give you a strong delusion if that's what you want. Now keep in mind, back in the Old Testament, we can think of King Ahab, who was going to go to battle, and he asked the king of Judah to go with him against the Syrians. And the king of Judah said, I'll go with you, but I want to talk to a prophet to see if we should go to battle or not. Well, King Ahab had all of his false prophets speak. Yes, you'll go into battle and you'll win, you'll do wonderful. And I guess the king of Judah, if you'll pardon the expression, kind of smelled a rat. And he said, do you have any other prophets here besides these? You know, when a guy's on payroll for the king, you kind of figure he's going to say what the king wants to hear. And almost humorously, King Ahab says, oh, yes, I've got one other prophet, Micaiah, but he always prophesies against me. Well, the king of Judah says, all right, I want to hear him. So they call Micaiah in, and I'm sure as he was coming in, somebody warned him, you better tell him what he wants to hear. So King Ahab says, Micaiah, should I go into battle against the Syrians and prosper? And Micaiah says, oh, yes, go to battle, go right ahead. You'll prosper, you'll do well. And I guess his sarcastic tone of voice was observed because King Ahab said, how many times have I told you to tell me the truth? It was kind of ironic because King Ahab was paying prophets to lie. And now he says, Micaiah, I thought I told you to tell me the truth. So finally Micaiah tells the truth. He says, well, I saw a vision in which God in heaven is saying, how shall we cause Ahab to go into battle and to be killed? And the angels or whoever's speaking to God says, send a lying spirit into the mouth of all of his prophets, and he will believe the lie, and he will go into battle and be killed. And when Micaiah revealed that to King Ahab, it made him furious. And they put Micaiah in prison and said, you will be in prison until I come back safely. Micaiah said, if you come back safely, then God has not spoken through me. What a powerful message, but it also shows us the very thing we see here. If you want to believe a lie, God will not only let you believe a lie, he will cause you to be lost, just like King Ahab died in battle. And we see that again elsewhere in the Bible. And so we have to be careful about our own attitude about the truth and whether we want to be comforted in a lie or comforted in God's Word. So what are some of the lessons we've learned tonight? Well, if my interpretation of this passage is true, then Paul was saying that it would be at least 400 years before the Lord's return. He didn't give that number to the Thessalonians, but he was trying to calm their fears down for them believing that Christ's coming was imminent. But search the Scriptures yourself to be sure that what is taught in the Scriptures is true, because one passage of the Scripture will always not contradict the other passages. So keep that in mind as you study this. And also realize on a personal level that if you choose to reject the gospel or any part of it, eventually God may allow you to believe a lie and be condemned for all time and eternity. So what should we do? Learn to love the truth. Proverbs says, buy the truth and sell it not. When Pilate asked Jesus, are you a king? He said, for this cause I was born, for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. So learn to love the truth. And secondly, learn to hate the pleasures of unrighteousness. Moses in Hebrews 11 chose to suffer with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Temptation and sin has caused many people to fall away from the Lord, to give up the faith, and to depart. That's what happened in the great apostasy that we read about in 2 Thessalonians 2. Many people follow after that religion because it comforts them. It encourages them to live in sin. It encourages them to be forgiven even though they've never repented. And so we know that's the false religion that Paul is talking about. But keep in mind, when you reject the truth, it's kind of ironic that people will accept just about any kind of superstition in its place. They'll believe in witchcraft. They'll believe in seances. They'll believe in ghosts. They'll believe in sorcerers. And we have a little bit of a problem with that today. If you want to watch or read books that are fictional books about sorcerers or sorcery, that's fine. But if you begin to believe there's something to it, then you're in grave danger. People who reject the truth always look for something to believe in. And the more ridiculous it is, it seems like the more likely some people are to believe it. So I thank you for listening to our lesson tonight. I hope this has at least given you some food for thought. And if you have comments or questions, as always, feel free to text me or email me. I'd be glad to discuss the subject with you.